Welcome to Eric's Perspective. Joining me today is Sandra Jackson-Dumont, CEO and Director of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. Sandra, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Great, thanks. And I think I have this right, but you were appointed the CEO and Director of the museum back in 2020, right?
Yes, January of 2020. I walked in the door January 15th, and then COVID happened and everyone went home on March 15th.
Great. So before we delve into the museum, I just thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about you. For example, starting at the beginning, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from San Francisco, the Fillmore district of San Francisco. Lived there till I was 18 years old. And so that's where I was born and raised, in that neighborhood.
Okay. And looking back, what would you say was that first sort of moment where you were exposed to art? Just not necessarily deciding you would go in that direction for a career, but can you remember your earliest exposure to art?
I think as a child, I mean, San Francisco is a city that's filled with so many murals, and I mean, it's a great place if you want to look at the mural tradition to like LA. San Francisco is that, and so I think we were always surrounded by art. I think, I mean, I give a funny talk about the fact that I think the first time I realized something was really a work of art was when I looked in the Bible or was at church and saw like laminated Jesus,
Uh-huh.
if you will, the little card that they give you. And so I think that that was like one of my early exposures to understanding that there was a place where these things could be taken care of in a museum. And so I knew that an artist had painted that. I'd say my true earliest exposure to art was really um, where I understood that there was someone who made those things, was Good Times with J.J. Evans as a painter.
Ah,
The great Ernie Barnes, who painted those incredible works that were featured on that show. And so I knew that there was an artist, so I knew there was a maker, and I knew that there was a skill set associated with making things. And so I think that was probably where I understood that it's a profession, and so those things together, I think, really helped me understand that.
oh, excellent, excellent. And did you also go to? Well, you said you were in the San Francisco area until you were 18, so you obviously went to high school, junior high, and all the rest of that there. Did you
Mhm.
take art classes when you were in high school or middle school?
When I was in high school, I don't really remember if I took any art. I remember drawing in middle school. And I can't remember if it was just in between periods or not, or like just to fill my day. But in high school, I did take an art class. And I went to George Washington High School, where there there's incredible works of art in that school. There's WPA murals,
Oh, wow.
and many of them have, I think, were in threat of being whitewashed most recently. Um, but um, but there are also, the football field had a relief sculpture by a great American artist, Black artist, Sergeant Johnson,
Ah,
and that painting, I didn't not painting that relief sculpture, which was the width of the football field and 2 stories high. I didn't know the entire time I was there in high school that that was made by a Black artist. It wasn't until I later on studied art history and realized that I was looking at my high school in a book.
wow.
So
Do you know if it's still there?
Oh yeah, it's still there. It's actually it's a structural piece. It's
Ah,
in the wall.
okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. And so you went to college. Where did you go to undergraduate school?
I went to undergrad in North of California, in Northern California, Sonoma State University. I'm a proud product of the California State University system, and so I went to Sonoma State University. which was a small liberal arts college. And years before I got there, people like Intisaki Shange taught there and folks like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
excellent. And so when you first started out, what was your major?
Biology.
Biology.
No one ever asked me that question. They just asked me what my degrees are in. They never asked me what I started out in. That's a great question. Started out in biology. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. And what attracted you? What attracted you to that as a major, biology?
Well, when I was younger, I really wanted to do something that was important. I'm the first of five children. I'm the fifth of five children to be born, but the first of my siblings to go to college,
Uh-huh.
and the second to graduate from high school of the five of us. And all my siblings are amazing people who I credit with keeping me out of trouble. And they, I really found a need to want to be a doctor. One, because I was decent at the sciences. I was curious about the human body. I was really interested in helping people.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in a community where people suffered from diabetes and a lot of different things, including in my household, my mom. And so I spent a lot of time at hospitals. And so I thought this was an incredible thing. And also to be a doctor is a reputable reputation,
Oh, sure.
reputable kind of field to go into.
Yeah.
And it also seemed to have a lot of social kind of clout at the time, I
Yeah.
mean, it still does. And so I really thought that that's how I could, one, make a living, two, make a difference, and three, actually contribute to my community. It wasn't until later that I realized that I could do that in many ways. Yeah.
Excellent. I think we're all the better for it, and we'll get into that in a minute. But so, at what point did you change majors? So I'm assuming you were started out as a biology major, but then you went into, was it art history, or do I have that right?
Yeah, so I started out in biology. It was my senior year. One of my friends who is an LA native had gone on the international exchange program to, she went to the Caribbean, interestingly enough. And I was just like, wow, what is that like? I didn't have a passport. I don't think I had traveled anywhere beyond like kind of California. Oh, I'd been to Mississippi, which is where my family's from, but I hadn't been anywhere else really.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd maybe been to, visit some other places, but Tennessee, places like that. But I'd only traveled in the U.S. And so I I went to the exchange office to see if I could do what she did, and I realized that I could go on a national student exchange. And so when I did that, I went to New York City on exchange, and it was like at the same time it reminded me of the Bay Area, like bigger, grittier, more robust version of the Bay Area,
Mm-hmm.
politicized, all that stuff. But the thing that really struck me was that I was also very much interested in the arts. And so I had taken an art history class in undergrad as a part of my just matriculation requirements, and fell in love with the stories. Interestingly enough, now where I work, and I fell in love with the stories behind the art that the professors were telling, and I also loved that these were like really kind of corny Poindexter type personalities, but actually had like the intellectual heft of the greatest among us. And I felt like they could position ideas in interesting ways. So I went on exchange to New York. I actually studied organic chemistry and took some painting courses. So I went back to undergrad, went back to my home campus, and I changed my major, and I studied studio art and art history. And that's how I ended up where I am.
Ah, excellent. And so the studio art part, was that drawing and painting and that sort of thing, or?
It was drawing and painting, and I took ceramics courses as well, printmaking, so yeah, it was a varied series of practices.
And I'm curious, do you still engage in your own creative expressions through art?
I don't make objects anymore, but so no, I'll just keep it there. No, I
Okay.
don't make objects or make art anymore. I participate in so many other creative efforts socially,
Yeah.
whether it's dancing or just, you know, making little drawings and things like that myself, but I don't present myself as an artist.
Okay. And when you took art history, I'm also curious to know, was there much talk in the classes about African American art?
You know, it's so interesting that you asked that question, particularly because that actually was one of the challenges I had when I went on exchange to New York. I took some art history courses, and I had taken an art history course in undergrad in California. And the professor was really progressive, Michael Schweigert, who's an incredible, incredible instructor. Even my Flemish art teacher was incredible. I had really great art history professors in undergrad in California. Michael really taught a course on contemporary art, and he also taught a course on modernism and modern art movements. And so it was in that class that I had learned about the Black Arts Movement. I learned about, you know, just Obasi. I learned about, which is the organization of Black artists. Anyway, just all of those things. I learned about women artists that were kind of undervalued. Then I went to New York and I went on exchange to Hunter College, and there was like the basic Janson's art history that I needed to take to kind of like ground me in the history of art. And I found that I was coming into that class with almost the appendix before walking into the class. I had learned all the stuff that would be in the addendum to the book
Right.
before I read the book.
Right.
And I found that to be really interesting. And so while I was there, I had an internship at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is the beginning of so many things. And I intentionally, when I went to New York, I had seen a documentary about the Studio Museum, and I was like, I really want to get an internship there. And I also wanted to, you know, dabble in graphic design, and so I worked at a graphic design company. But to answer your question, I didn't see a lot of what I now actually promote and am very committed to integrating into the art historical canon, which is people of color, underrepresented people, women,
Yes.
you know, people of varied, you know, genders across the spectrum, and of different interests and content. And I didn't see that at all. I didn't see enough of it at all.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I remember uh, looking over the Jansen book. H.W. Jansen is what we're talking about. And I remember reading he had an entry in there for Henry Tanner. And I'm glad that he included him, but I was a little disappointed in the way he was presented. It was almost like a way to, and believe me, and all of a sudden I'm blanking out on Tanner's mentor's name, but it was a way to actually compliment him for what he did for Tanner, which he deserved, but it was less about Tanner himself. I just thought that was a little disappointing in the Jansen book. And there was a lot else missing, as you point out, and it ends up as an appendix later on. But
Yeah.
that's kind of a common story. And the same thing with the story about the women artists as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of the shortcomings of our art history in many instances that I'm aware of. So you interned at Studio Museum in Harlem. How was that, by the way?
I was an intern there, and Hunter College had a great what they called externship program where you could intern at different. You could apply for internships in different places, and they would broker the introductions. And so they introduced me to the Studio Museum, and they were so busy that I wasn't able to get a call back. And then a friend of mine had invited me to an event at the Studio Museum because his internship, had set it up for him to go to this opening, and at the time. So I went with him to it, and then I had the good fortune of actually seeing in person the person that I was calling all the time. Then it was calling all the time, and so and she was just like, I'm really sorry I haven't gotten back to you. Why don't you come up next week and we'll sit down. And a very shy Sandra at the time found herself in an interview for an internship. And my first job as an intern, or my first post, was as an intern in the communications department, which I feel is a stop that everyone who works at a cultural institution should work in, an area or a stop that everyone should have, because it helps you think about how you communicate in writing and otherwise, and position things. But my first role was there. Then it was in the director's office, which also was very helpful. And then I ended up in curatorial for the rest of my tenure there, and then came back many times over, and then ended up working there as well.
Wow. Okay. And in the interim, so you after you graduated from Sonoma, you went to graduate school, right?
Yes.
And where did you go to graduate school?
I went to graduate school at Howard University
Ah,
in
okay.
Washington, D.C.
Ah, okay. And was obviously you were pursuing art history. Am I right about that?
Yes, I decided to study art history at that great school there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's fantastic because Howard probably has one of the has a storied history on with art. James Porter and David Driscoll and all those folks down there did a
Mm-hmm.
fabulous job. It has a tremendous collection. I think is still intact, if I'm right
Mm-hmm.
about that. And so, what was your experience like at Howard?
It was wonderful. I went to Howard, I felt like I chose that school because exactly the same things that you mentioned. There's been recently there was a Black portraiture exhibition at LACMA that featured so many great Black artists. Many of them either taught at Howard University or were students at Howard University or somehow connected into that ecosystem. Not the least of which were the great Tritobia Benjamin, uh, you know, uh, just so many. I'm the Afrocobra. Jeff Donaldson was the chair of the department of the entire school, the fine art, the entire art school when I was there. There was Floyd Coleman, who was a great scholar. Just incredible, incredible people. Lois Maylou Jones, because I was a student at the at Howard University in the art program. Dr. Benjamin was the leading scholar, Tritobia Benjamin, on Lois Maylou Jones. She actually couldn't travel with her, and I got to travel to New York City, a very young Sandra, with the legendary Lois Maylou Jones,
Oh, wow.
to New York City, to an opening at the Studio Museum in Harlem, no less, where I saw
Wow.
artists like Herb Gentry, artists like, scholars and curators like Lowry Sims, who all of these folks later became like true friends and mentors of mine to date. And so I think that the Studio Museum and has continued to play a role in my life, but Howard University, I think, has not only been something that's been important to me intellectually, but a place that also, I think, oftentimes can be underestimated for its social connections that lead to professional excellence, I think. Yeah.
Those
And the
na-
collection alone there is phenomenal.
oh,
Most historically Black colleges and universities have incredible, incredible art collections. And Howard is not nearly the least among them. It's really a great collection.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And what an opportunity to travel with Lois M. Jones up to New York. I'm getting goosebumps hearing you describe that. That's fantastic. And of course, we should mention Elizabeth Catlett is a graduate of Howard University as well. Another
Oh yeah.
legendary artist who is no longer with us, but contributed
Yeah.
so much to the canon.
Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, just to be able to, walk the halls where these folks were. When you are a graduate student in art history, they allow you to have a space. Like if you want it, you can either work from home or you can have a little space. And you know, they opened a room and it had like all the slides and all this stuff. And,
oh my goodness.
there was like some of James Porter's stuff that was still there, first Black Rhodes Scholar. It's just like,
Oh
you're
wow.
sitting there and you're just like trying to reserve your little corner, but it's this storage room of like all this iconic history behind you.
Oh
And
my
you
goodness.
can't help but to like pick up a piece of paper and be like, it's the thinnest paper in the world back because that's what they use. But you were like, wow.
I can imagine that must have been extremely beneficial and exciting all at the same time being down there. So
Yeah.
after you earned your degree from Howard, what happened next? Where did you go?
Um, while I was in graduate school, I was teaching high school at Duke Ellington School for the Arts, which is a world class, world renowned arts high school, visual and performing arts high school in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, in DC. And I was working on exhibitions and curating shows and doing stuff like that. But after I finished graduate school, I got accepted to a fellowship at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It's called the Independent Study Program, affectionately known as the ISP program,
Mm-hmm.
which is a Marxist theory program centered in the arts. And so you study every, Fanon, Frantz Fanon to Michel Foucault to Derrida, Nietzsche, Benjamin. You learn, and you're not reading a lot of that for the first time. You're actually applying it to artistic practice and conversation,
Mm-hmm.
so that you're actually unpacking works of art through a lens that is highly critical of the purpose and function of art intellectually and or in other ways socially.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a year program, and I was a curatorial fellow. They had curatorial fellows, arts fellows, or studio fellows, and critical studies fellows. I was a curatorial fellow, so I curated an exhibition with a couple of colleagues. I also showed work in the art show as well. And so I moved to New York after DC, and I participated in this program, and it was fantastic and
Oh.
challenging and incredible. And it actually pushed me into a different type of museum, because I was, all of our time was spent at the Whitney in their programming area, and with curators, et cetera, and with educators. So it helped me understand the practical nature of building an exhibition, working with complex ideas to make them accessible to the general public. And while at the same time making sure that one doesn't dummy down the content, but makes it something that people really are interested in and that they find themselves connected to in compelling ways. And so that's where I was in New York. And then I ended up being employed right after that at the Whitney,
Oh.
and curated independent projects and worked with galleries to write essays about artists and things like that.
Ah, okay.
Making a living in the art world, that's all.
Excellent. And at some point, you ended up at the Metropolitan Museum. Am I skipping over too much by jumping from the Whitney
No,
to the next one?
while I loved being at the Met, I also worked at the Studio Museum and the Seattle Art Museum. I worked in other places, and I never wanted to work at the Met, but it was just such an incredible opportunity to re-envision the programming that was being done there, and also create, whether it was very academic programming, so funding fellowships or working with school children or designing curriculum for the city, or or pulling together major convenings for artists like Carrie James Marshall, or for any number of artists, or creating and building a conservation program in India. And so there's a whole range of things that we did there, and I'm just touching the surface.
Sure.
But it felt like an opportunity to understand what it meant to be at that scale, and how we could actually make it feel intimate and accessible to so many people who could benefit from the resources that great institution offers.
Oh, yeah. And I'm just curious, because you mentioned Lowry Sims earlier. Was she there at the same time you were there?
Oh no, Lowry was at the Met for 25 years. And I worked with, when I went to work at the Studio Museum after I left the Whitney, I went to work at the Met, at the Studio Museum, 2000, I think it was, maybe a little before, but I went to work at the Studio Museum, and Thelma and I used to be at the Whitney together. She was more, Thelma Golden. She was very incredible curator, director of the Studio Museum. She left the Whitney and went to work at the Studio Museum under Lowry Sims, who had left the Met to go and work at the Studio Museum. And so then they called me and invited me to work at the Studio Museum, and recruited me to work there. So we became this team of 3 that were working at the Studio Museum in Harlem. So that's where I became intimately connected to Lowry. I knew her before then, but I became intimately connected with her there because I worked with her every day. And so she wasn't at the Met when I was there. So years later, after I left the studio, went to Seattle, came back, I ended up, Lowry had retired from the studio at that before I even left. So she had been at the Met for 25 years though before I got there.
Right, and as I understand it, she was the first African American curator at the Met, right?
Yeah, she's the first Black curator, not just African American, Black of any kind.
Of any origin.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so she and it's only and then I was the first Black person to be in a senior leadership role there. And you think about it, it's an amazing place, but over the course of 150 years, like that's a lot of time that's passed.
Sure.
But since then, there are a few Black curators there now that they've hired over the last couple of years.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Tomasini, and Andrea Achi. She is a incredible medieval Nubianist.
And you said Nubianist, as in Nubia in Egypt.
As in Nubia, People think about medieval art and they think Europe only, but medieval is a period in time. It can be anywhere.
Sure.
And so she actually has a specialization in Nubian art as it relates to the medieval period. And she can curate a whole bunch of other things, but I think she's such a special, incredible intellect. And then Achille Tomasini is another incredible human being as well.
Oh, I love it.
Comes out of modern and contemporary. He specializes in Leger, but he is, and he's from Brownsville, New York. Incredible brother.
Excellent. I love that though, the Nubian art. That's fantastic. I love it.
And she's not in the African art department. She's in the medieval department.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was like in Seattle, by the way? I know that the Seattle Museum, one notable artist that's shown there is Jacob Lawrence. Did you have any, I don't know about the time frame or not, but did you have any encounters with him by any chance while you were there? Or does that come later?
Oh, no, he had passed away by the time I got to Seattle. But my relationship to Jacob Lawrence is actually pretty significant. When I was at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Gwen Knight, Jacob Lawrence had passed, and Gwen Knight and her, friends had decided that they were going to give some of their resources, hers and Jacob Lawrence's resources, to museums. And so they had gifted a significant amount of money to the Studio Museum to fund a residency at the Studio Museum, or continue to support the residency program that's already been there. Excuse me, I left the Studio Museum, and they also funded a teen program that I oversaw there, or I built there. So I left there and I went to Seattle. And when I got to Seattle, the then director of the museum was an incredible woman named Mimi Gates. She is the stepmother of Bill Gates Jr. So she's married. She was married to Bill Gates Sr.
Okay.
And Mimi Gates is the museum director, and she hired me at the Seattle Art Museum. And when I got there, she told me that she wanted me to be the curator to oversee the Gwendolyn Knight Jacob Lawrence Prize. And so over the last, since 2006, 2006. Is it 2006? No, since 2000 and yeah, 2006. I've been giving every other year. I give a prize to a Black artist who shows promise, who is not necessarily emerging, but is not necessarily super well known. All of those artists that we've given that award to have since become very well known. So you have Theaster Gates. Actually, this past year, I gave it to Lauren Halsey, and Lauren is an LA through and through artist. And she has a show right now at the Seattle Art Museum. They get a show and they get money. And the hope is that the museum will acquire works from every one of the shows. So Lauren Halsey, Latoya Ruby Frazier, who just had a show, it may even still be up at the African American Museum here. Theaster Gates, Titus Kafar. The list is really, it goes on. It's a really wonderful group of people.
And I love
Sandra
that.
Perry, whose work is actually in the Venice Biennale right now. Some great artists. And so those are all artists that were supported by money that came from a fellowship that Gwen Knight and Jacob Lawrence left money for. Well, really Gwen Knight did. She said she wanted to support artists that shared their values. And she wanted to make sure that there was always a place for Black artists at the Seattle Art Museum. It's the only gallery that has the name of an artist on it, at least up until a couple of years ago. There were all the galleries have somebody's name on it, but none of them have artist names. And it says the Gwendolyn Knight Jacob Lawrence Gallery inside of the Seattle Art Museum. And so their support for artists continues.
I think that's fabulous, and obviously very important for the development of artists that we may not otherwise have exposure to. For those viewers and listeners who are not aware, Gwendolyn Knight is an artist herself and was the wife of Jacob Lawrence.
Yeah, and he taught and lived in Seattle for well over 30 years, and was a tenured professor. I think he might have been the first artist in the country to receive, or maybe he's one of the few artists, certainly I think the first Black artist to receive tenure at a major university. He was beloved in that city, and they rode the bus every day. They rode the bus everywhere. They didn't drive.
Oh, wow. I love that.
I have great stories about them if you ever want to hear them.
Oh, no, absolutely. And those are great stories, too. It's nice to see their commitment to continuing the support of artists and so forth that require it and need it and deserve it so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's see. You were at the Met, and from the Met, you came to where you are now. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Came to the Lucas Museum. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think maybe we should, can you tell us a little bit about the Lucas Museum, which is, if I'm correct, it's still under construction, right?
It is still under construction. I'm thrilled to say that I stood on the 5th floor of the building earlier this week and saw the view of Los Angeles that I think is going to be a new view for MIDI. We're a museum dedicated to the art of storytelling, and we believe that through visual storytelling, the museum will expand the role of art in museums for society. The museum is an institution that we hope will inspire thought-provoking ideas and conversations that are relevant. And we also want them to be relevant within and beyond our geographic boundaries. We definitely want to be about the local, but we think that what happens locally and the conversations that we're having really can radiate and be a part of what's happening in the world, and they're tethered to what's happening in the world.
Yes.
And we think that one of our other efforts is to really catalyze more connected and empathetic spaces, so that we believe that this museum and what we do here will connect us to create a more just society. That is our moonshot.
Oh, I love that. And so when you say connect elsewhere, I'm assuming because this is the age of electronics, that obviously that's one way people can access by going online, I'm guessing. But does this mean, and I know a lot of museums do this anyway, traveling exhibitions, and will you also have like satellite spaces and things like that? Or I'm not sure exactly how else you plan to reach out. I was just wondering if you could tell us.
Yeah. So I right now I don't see us having a satellite space, especially since I'm trying to just get this building open.
Yeah, you talk to her hard
um,
to just get that going.
Talk to me after we open this building. But the reality is that we believe that this the work we have actually is available, and that we will be having traveling exhibitions. We want to be a museum that has its work out in the world, and for this to be a beacon of engagement for people to come here. Certainly through technology, we can be many places, but I also think we really want to be old school about it.
Yes.
We should be where we want to be. And so if I want us to be in East LA, I should be going to East LA. You know what I mean? If I want us to be, so we should never trade in always the physical for the digital. We want to figure out ways that there can be both. And it doesn't mean that it also has to be one or the other. I think that we want to be a place that is dialogic, where we're in dialogue with the world.
Yes.
Far too long, museums and cultural institutions have kind of sat neatly adjacent to what's happening in society. And we believe that the art that is created, that is considered narrative, really is sometimes it's a positive conversation, sometimes it's a negative conversation. Sometimes the work that's been created about people doesn't necessarily reflect truth. And so we think that this can be a place for discourse about some of those critical issues. And we think that can happen online in real time, and in writing, and physically in other places as well.
I like that. And you were talking earlier, even in your earlier experience, I heard you use the word accessible a lot. And I think for a lot of people, when you say museums and you say art and so forth like that, they kind of get intimidated. And what I like about what you're saying is you're trying to sort of be part of the community, not sitting outside of it, maybe sitting up on top of a pedestal or something, and people feel like they're not capable of reaching an understanding about what's going on in there. It sounds like you want to be a part of the whole conversation.
Yeah, I've done studies on how people are engaged in museums, and there are a couple of things that are often said, and I feel like I think people assume, or what they get from reports is that people don't feel welcome. That's what a lot of content gets boiled down to. A lot of the interviews is that people don't feel welcome. The community doesn't feel welcome, or they don't understand, or they feel like you're too elite, or they're intimidated.
Yes.
And then when I have gone beyond the report and into the comments of many of these reports that I myself have commissioned at times, what is really being said, or when I'm in interviews or in conversations with people, is that it's not that people are intimidated. They're just not interested in what you're presenting at times. In some cases, it is really, truly that simple, because it's more intimidating in some ways to go to Neiman Marcus or some other clothing store that actually is a luxury brand, because it feels like you're walking into something where the price of things, all these things, know that most of them have guards and those things. But our people of color, people in general, people that are from varied backgrounds, make their way to those stores.
Yeah.
If for no other reason, just a window shop, you know what I mean? But we make our ways to those stores. And we also will save our money to buy the thing that we really want. And so if we translate that idea into cultural practice or into museums, there's a reason why people sometimes don't consume some of the things that are happening in cultural institutions. And I don't mean they need to be popular or they need to be anything other than what they are, but we do need to pay attention to connecting with people like you would any other product that you would be trying to share with people. And I think the art world has historically been an institution, or the arts have been institutions that are kind of have created the reputation for themselves that people don't get us. They aren't cultured enough. They don't know. they think, and I think that creates a safety for a lot of people that are functioning in these spaces, because it creates a hierarchy and a specialization. For me, I actually I love when people go on tours with me, or they do things with me, or people that I find also compelling, because they are like, I get that. I can ask a question, I can share my point of view. And I think that what we're doing is what a lot of businesses just do, which is think about who you want to talk to, find out as much as you can about who you want to talk to, and go talk to them and speak the language that they speak, right?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think that I also want to say that one of the things that I have found is that the most under-resourced people in that I have ever connected with, whether they're my family members or people or myself at a certain point, or studies that I've done, almost everyone understands what a museum is.
Okay.
And they understand that's important. That belongs in a museum. So when you go to like a Nike or something like that, or a shoe store, you walk in, and if it's nicely designed, what do you see? You see a sneaker, you see a tennis shoe, a sneaker, a shoe on a podium with almost like that work behind you. And it's a sneaker or a purse on a podium. And they'll even go so far as put a plexiglass box on it to make it feel like a museum. So there are all these like subtle cues that come from this place that creates value called a museum, and so people are like, you belong in a museum, or that belongs in a museum, or I want to be in a museum, you know. And so people understand the purpose of them. We just need them to feel more soulful and intellectually rigorous in a way that doesn't create intellectual oppression, where there's a distance between the idea and the person you're trying to connect to. And so I think that people get museums, and maybe it's because I'm working from that place that I've seen a real abundance of participation in a lot of work that I feel like we've been doing in museums that I've worked in. But hands down, I think that some people most people don't consume certain things because they're not interested in that.
When you say that, you know, I can remember having discussions with professionals in the art world, and some of the feedback I was hearing is that what you've just said is especially true with young people who are like really into social media and so forth, and perhaps things aren't as interesting and attractive to them because they're satisfying that need in other ways. Do you think that's a valid point? Have you noticed that?
No, I don't think. I think if you were to walk in, when I worked at the Seattle Art Museum, we did a 5-year study funded by the Wallace Foundation, and it was focused on 18 to 35-year-olds. So that was between 2005, 6, and 2015, 13, 14, something like that. And we studied their behaviors and their interest in art and culture, and also in philanthropy or giving to museums. And what we found was that they really they're not subscription people. So that was a big thing. You know, it's like, I don't want to give my money to something and then not be able to use it. But they did sign up for gyms. And so, and when they signed up for a museum or a cultural institution, and when they were interviewed, they would say, if I signed up for a gym and I was moving and I couldn't use my membership anymore, I'd want to shut it down and then make sure that I wasn't charged anymore. For a museum or cultural institution membership, they'd be like, I'll just let it run out. Because I know that it's going to a good cause. And they also saw, so that's one piece of it. I also think that what I found there was that when we did a study of the museum's attendance, there was 33.3% of the people that came to that museum were between the ages of 18 and 35.
Oh, wow.
If I added people below the age of 18, I'm sure that number would go up, because it includes school groups and families, et cetera. So it would go up dramatically. But the membership was not that.
I see.
Because there wasn't that kind of participation from a membership point of view. That's just not how that community or that age demographic ran through the world. At the time when I started the study, I was squarely within the demographic. By the time I was done, I was outside of it. So I actually was one of the people that was kind of like, I didn't fit in it. I didn't consume culture that way. I would never have a subscription to the opera because I wouldn't want to be so pinned down to coming every whatever day. I wouldn't buy tickets to a football team or a basketball game or something. Right. I wouldn't buy season tickets. That's just me.
I understand.
There are other people that sit outside of that. The same thing is true when I went to the Met and I ran those same numbers, and literally 33.3% of the total attendance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art fit within not the membership, but the attendance numbers were between the ages of 18 and 35. When I took people younger than 18 to 35 or younger than 18, that number went up to 42% of the people that were actually coming to the Met on an annual basis at that time. Almost half of the population fit in the younger demographic, which tells us that they actually are coming to these things. But when we measure participation in museums, we often do it through how people become members.
I see.
And so it's actually really phenomenal. This generation of young people on social media, they want to come to museums and they want to take pictures of stuff. They want to come to the events. They want to be, but they are doing what I found in Seattle to be the magic ingredient. And it's what we do for our board members, but we just need to remember that we need to do it for the general public, which is that they want the social and the intellectual to happen at the same time. They want to think about when you go to an event as a commissioner or as a community member, there's a cocktail reception. So the social people talk, and then you get to look at the works of art. Right. For the general public, we're like, go look at art.
Right.
And so we have to create these spaces for people to kind of come together in intimate and social ways with art and culture. That doesn't mean drinks. That doesn't mean all of those kinds of things, but it means creating spaces where people can play and think at the same time, and those aren't considered mutually exclusive.
Okay. And I'm assuming then that's gone into the design of the museum. Is that right?
We're working on that. Yes, all the things that we do, we really want to make sure that we're very specific about the kinds of experiences that we're creating. Every experience won't be that, because some people do just want to come and hear a lecture or hear a talk and participate in a conversation. Some people want to walk the park, the 11-acre park that we're creating. But perhaps they can walk the park with artists, or they can walk the park and we can do poetry readings while we walk the park. At the Met, our live arts team that I oversaw, we had something called the Museum Workout, where we commissioned dancers to choreograph an entire workout through the entire museum. And so you would stand in front of a work of art and you would hear about the work of art while you're moving in the galleries.
Oh, wow.
So it's really like thinking differently about space and place and the purpose of it. So museums less as temples and more as temples and living rooms and dance halls and classrooms. You know, they can be all of that if we just let our hair down a little bit, you know?
I love that. I like that idea a lot. Yeah. And I think all of us, not just here, not in the Southern California area, but people coming to visit will be in for sounds like a real treat, for sure. Can you talk a little bit about the collection? I was just curious, so that folks understand, because the museum is called the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, and you mentioned earlier that the art is telling stories. And so how does that play out? Can you give just a couple of examples of how that might play out?
Oh, sure. So the number one question people ask me is, what is narrative art? And I often ask them back. I usually say, why don't you tell me? I'll tell you what it is from my point of view, but you tell me what you think it is. And so I'll ask you that really quickly, Eric.
Well, the first thing that jumps into mind is, so when I opened my gallery in 1988, it was with Elizabeth Catlett, and she had a series called I Am the Negro Woman series. And that was just obvious narrative art. She had 14 panels, originally 15, but 14 panels that told the story of various experiences and contributions by African American women over the years. And so the first thing that jumps into my mind, and that's kind of an obvious one, but that's what really immediately came to my own mind. This art that in this case tells the story about Black women, and of course it was done in the 40s, so Black women up to the 1946, 47 era.
Yeah. Well, you hit it on the head. The narrative art. Well, narratives in general are the stories we live with, right? They're what's around us. They're also the stories that we actually manufacture at times.
Yes.
You see it in media, you see it in your loved ones, you see it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
You can construct narratives. But under all of those circumstances, they inform how we view and understand the world. They give shape to, and they inform characters. They inform real events. They inform imagined realities, and they also inform systems of power. And narrative art gives visual form to very specific stories, or and the meanings and actions and the intentions behind those stories. They are often readily apparent in the arrangement of the figures that are presented. Or the representations of some actions, icons, symbology, that all can create narratives. Narratives can also be suggested through mood and atmosphere, or the use of symbols, as I mentioned, but the perspective of the viewer is super important in narrative art. And so people bring their own ideas and issues and ideas to works of art in general. And then there's the intention of the artist, but there's a lot left to interpretation, right?
Right.
And I think that narrative art also reflects human experiences and aspirations, and they can be read across time, culture, and language. And so the term narrative art really had its first appearance like in the 1960s. And visual storytelling has always been a central function of art. So much of the art world has kind of been shaped around this notion of narrative art in many ways. Our approach is to take an inclusive approach to visual storytelling, exploring both academically rooted and mass-produced art forms. So taking something that was really informed, like Rembrandt, and then also something that's a part of popular culture. So sculptures that were put in town squares to help create a certain image and narrative about people and place. And also just real like printed materials. So like, publications that were printed or posters that were printed. And so it includes a host of things. And so if I were to give you a few examples, I would say, of course, everyone knows that Norman Rockwell is we would look at his paintings, most of his paintings as narrative, but there are lots of artists who are, Gerhard Richter is a well-known artist and, but known as an abstractionist, but his work, his work only arrives there because he actually went through the space of narrative art. So, I feel that most artists have had some dance with narrative art. And so you can, I don't know that I would say these are narrative artists. I would say this is a narrative artwork.
That makes sense. Example. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So Artemisia Gentileschi, we have two Artemisia Gentileschi paintings in our collection. I would say John Biggers. We have like beautiful John Biggers, Charles Whites. We have Carrie James Marshall. We have wonderful LA-based artist, Judy Baca. A lot of people know that we have her incredible archive, as well as like all of the drawings that made up the LA River Project. Yeah, I can go on. We have indigenous art. We have art by the Tongva people in our collection. We have Tongva artists, I should say, in our collection. Um, yeah, it cuts across place and time. We have works from the 1700s in our collections up to works that were made last year.
I love that. I love the inclusiveness of it, not just culturally, ethnically, and so forth, but time and
Mhm.
style and like you said, it's not just fine art, so to speak, but it's also commercial art. Sounds like published, like posters and so forth like that. I
Yeah,
think that's great that you're doing that.
but I should say that the works that we've created, so we have the original. So let's say it's a comic book.
Hmm.
So we have the original cover of said Spider-Man that the artist made.
I see.
Not necessarily, so people can actually start to see that work in the way that, say, Kerry James Marshall sees that work. He doesn't see that as less than his fine art. He
Right.
sees it as something that should be hung alongside that work.
Yes. Yes.
It's if you were to say, I'm trying to think of other really good examples of that. We have the original posters for certain films that were made.
Hmm.
We of course have the separate cinema archive and collection. So we also have like this incredible collection of collections here.
Oh.
And these were everything I'm mentioning are works that were collected by the museum. And and then there's the works that will be gifted to us as well.
Oh, fantastic. And am I right, if I remember correctly from talking with you before, you'll have a library at the museum. Is that correct?
Yes, we'll have a library. I stood in it yesterday. It's wonderful. It's a library. It will look out. The window is like 2.5 stories high. It's beautiful, kind of half circle window that looks out onto an incredible lawn of grass that I hope to see people laying on, reading, dancing, doing all kinds of things. The library is pretty special, and we see it as somewhat of the stacks where we'll be bringing what has normally been kind of tucked away into the public space where people can see things that they've never seen before. Lots of things from the Lucasfilm archive, of which we are the lucky recipients of as well.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah.
That's fantastic. Will film be involved? You mentioned Lucas. Will there be any film in the archive or no?
We actually have two theaters, 299 seats each,
Oh,
that are state of the art theaters, and so we will show films. And we also want to, so we won't have a ton of films at our site, but we will show films.
I see.
So we won't have a ton of film material in our collection. We have some, definitely we have film cells, but we love the fact that our partner, the Academy Museum, does that very well,
Yes.
and we can partner with them on any of the other efforts as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a newly opened and excellent museum. I'm glad you brought it up. That's LA is definitely humming along here with between that and you guys and some of the other stuff we have here. This is fantastic.
LACMA's going to open. They're like expansion projects and new things that are happening. I love what they're doing at the Museum of Natural History. They're creating, like really changing that end part of their building that's going to be across the street from ours. I really see this as like an opportunity to create really truly a cultural district that feels like a hub, like a location to come to,
Absolutely.
but also be people's backyards. I'm a firm believer that people shouldn't have to go to a whole bunch of other cities to get something they can get in their neighborhood. I think they should be able to come and walk over to a place. And I think uh, even if they can't walk here, they can get off the train and then walk.
Absolutely.
um, but
Absolutely.
I think this is a good moment for Los Angeles. I'm excited about being here. It's a city I never imagined living in. I grew up coming here as a child, visiting my aunt who lived in Carson, actually,
Uh-huh.
and my mother's older sister, and I never imagined living here. And I can't imagine being anywhere else at this moment. It's such a great, it's an incredible moment in this city. It really is.
I couldn't agree more. I'm very excited. And so that kind of begs the question, and about when do you think the museum will be open? I know that's probably a tough one because sometimes things get delayed. I know COVID probably pushed everything back quite a bit, but do you have any idea?
We're saying 23, 24 is when we hope to be ready. But that's all I can say right now.
Oh, sure. Not to pin you down.
I'm also just one who's always trying to like speak the truth and point to hope, this kind of thing. And so that is the truth. We're looking at 23, 24. When that changes and we get something more solid and a specific date, I really will sing it from the mountaintop.
Excellent. And so that gives me this chance to ask for those viewers and listeners who want to kind of follow what's going on. Is there a website or is there any other method that they can reach out and find out what's happening?
Yeah, lucasmuseum.org is our website. You can also go to our Instagram. We post periodically there. And that's Lucas Museum. If you type that in on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, we sometimes host conversations in those spaces. We do a lot of talking about other cultural institutions in the city and other things that are happening. We've really been trying to, since I got here, we've tried to be where things are happening, not just trying to create more. Yes. We're trying to support what's there and participate in what's in other places, and then also do some programming, but we needed to put our heads down and really get ready for what will really truly be a big moment for everyone working here. And I think I keep telling folks, we're not just building a building, we're building a 200+ year proposition. That's what this institution is. Yes. You don't build museums and they go away tomorrow. Like, the whole goal is to actually have them live in the world in a way that what was once considered just an institution or a new proposition in the Whitney, the Studio Museum, LACMA, the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the International Center for Photography. All of these places were places that at one point people were like, why do you need to build that? Yeah. And MoMA, you guys don't need an institution dedicated to modern art, but there wasn't one dedicated to that. Right. The same thing with, the African-American Museum here. Like, there needed to be an African-American museum so that there could be carving out of space and research and depth and collecting practice and all of that stuff, so people can really see it and it be, unpacked and supported. The same thing is true for, photography, which was the stepchild of the art world for so long, and it wasn't until some institutions like the International Center for Photography said, we're going to go and create a place in the sun for this work. Narrative art, which is interesting, we're doing the same thing, but narrativity fits into every single thing I just mentioned, whether it's fashion or style or photography or in any of those things. And so we actually will be very much like those places where we will need to stand the test of time. And so it's a good moment. It's really, it's fantastic.
I am very, very excited, and I'm sure everybody is eagerly awaiting the opening of this museum. I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective, Sandra Jackson-Dumont. And I want to ask everybody to be sure to be on the lookout for this museum. Follow what's going on the website and the social media outlets, as she mentioned. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for joining us at Eric's Perspective. Thanks so much, Sandra. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.